Badges on the table as your name is called. Let's keep this orderly, gentlemen. 41 years my father worked this floor. 31 for me, and you're doing it with envelopes.
The maintenance function is being transitioned to an overseas vendor. It's in the letter.
Effective Friday. Benefits run through month's end. There's a number to call with questions. Sam Corrigan built this airline on a promise. Nobody here ever gets an envelope. He shook my father's hand on it. Right here, in this hangar.
Mr. Corrigan passed 4 months ago. A company has to be able to survive the people who built it. That's just arithmetic, Mr. Miller. Take the envelope. There's my badge. You can have that.
This, though? This you don't get. The old man pinned this on my father in 1985, in this hangar, with his own 2 hands. You've got the airline now. You'll never have this.
And Roy Fenwick walked out of the building his family had given 72 years to, and 3 days later, on a flight he had no business being able to afford, he would give up his seat to a grieving stranger in the back of the plane and hand her, without ever knowing it, the one thing that could burn Victor Lund's whole plan to the ground. Roy Fenwick was 56 years old, and he came from a family that fixed airplanes, and until that Friday he had believed, the way you believe the ground is solid, that he always would. His father, Ed, had started at Corrigan Airlines in the 60s, back when it was one turboprop in a hangar with a leaky roof and a man named Sam Corrigan who did his own books at night. Ed had turned wrenches there for 41 years. Roy had grown up in that hangar, did his homework on a tool cart, learned the name of every part before he learned to drive, went to work there the week he turned 25, and never left. 31 years. Between the two of them, father and son, they had put their hands on Corrigan airplanes for 72 years. And it had meant something because Sam Corrigan had made it mean something. Sam was the kind of boss who knew your kids' names and came to the funerals, and when times got hard, and in the airline business times were always getting hard, took a pay cut himself before he ever cut yours. He used to walk the hangar floor at night and stop at every station and say the same thing, the line the whole company ran on. Everybody here has their hands on the same airplane. The fella who flies it and the fella who fixes it and the gal who books the seat. Same airplane. Don't ever let anybody tell you different. He believed the mechanic in the hangar and the pilot in the cockpit were doing the same job, which was keeping people alive, and he paid and treated them like it. And Sam Corrigan had made Ed Fenwick a promise the day he pinned a set of brass wings on his coveralls in 1985, a little pin he gave every mechanic who hit 10 years, his own design. "Long as I've got a breath in me and a plane in the air," Sam had said, "nobody who wears these wings ever gets walked out with an envelope. That's not how we do it here. That's a promise, Ed." Sam had kept that promise for the rest of his life. Through 2 recessions, a fuel crisis, a merger that nearly ate them, and 1 very bad year. Roy still remembered when Sam sold his own boat to cover a payroll gap rather than lay off a single soul. Other airlines shed workers like a snake sheds skin, every downturn on schedule. Corrigan never did. It was slower to grow because of it, and smaller and less profitable on paper, and the men who worked there would have walked through a wall for it, and every one of them believed, because it was true, that they were part of something that would not sell them out. That belief was worth money, though it never showed up as a line item. It showed up as a mechanic staying past his shift, unpaid, because a squawk on a landing gear didn't sit right with him, and he wasn't going home until it did. It showed up as 40 years without a single maintenance-caused incident, which is not luck. Luck doesn't hold for 40 years. It showed up in the quiet, unmeasurable way that a company full of people who are not afraid does better work than a company full of people who are. Sam Corrigan knew all of that in his bones and never needed it proven, and he built one of the safest small airlines in the country on nothing more complicated than treating the man under the wing like he mattered as much as the man in the corner office. Roy Fenwick had grown up inside that. It was the water he swam in. He had never once, in 56 years, imagined the water could simply be drained. He'd been dead 4 months. Sam had, when Victor Lund broke the whole thing in a single afternoon. The other thing that happened that week, the thing that made Roy Fenwick get on an airplane at all, was that his father died. Ed Fenwick was 81, and he'd been fading for a while, and he went in his sleep on a Tuesday, 4 days after his son got laid off from the airline he'd given his life to, which was a mercy in one way, because it meant Ed never had to know. Roy had sat by the bed and not told him. Let the old man go, believing the promise had held, believing his boy still had the job, believing Sam's word still meant something in that hangar. It was the last thing Roy could do for his father, and he did it, and it cost him more than the layoff had. The funeral was 3 states away in the small town where Ed had grown up and where the plot was, next to Roy's mother. And Roy, who had just lost his income and his health insurance and a career in the same week, did the math on getting there and came up short until he remembered the one thing he had left. His flight benefits ran through the end of the month. A laid-off mechanic could still fly standby on his own dying airline for a few more weeks. So Roy Finnick booked a standby seat on a Corrigan flight to go bury his father, wearing his father's wings pin on his jacket, and he did not appreciate the irony because he was too tired and too sad to appreciate anything. His wife, Sandra, couldn't come. Somebody had to stay with her mother, so Roy flew alone, which is how he came to be in seat 22C aisle on a Tuesday afternoon, with everything he had left in the world folded into a garment bag and a grief he could barely lift, when a flight attendant named Faye Duggan came down the aisle looking for someone kind and stopped at his row. I hate to ask," Faye said low, leaning in, "but you look like a decent sort and I need one. What's going on?" "Got a lady back in the last row, middle seat 31E. Faye glanced back. "She's not doing well, real bad flyer, and she's traveling with her husband, his ashes, in an urn in her lap. She won't check it, won't put it up top, holds it the whole flight. And she's white as a sheet and shaking, and I can't move her up front, the flight's full." Faye's voice dropped further. "She shouldn't be in a middle seat squeezed between 2 strangers with that in her arms. It isn't right. I've been doing this 30 years, and it just isn't right." Roy was already unbuckling. "Take my seat for her, aisle. I'll take the middle in the back." "You sure? It's a 5-hour?" "I'm sure." He stood, got his bag down. "Lady's carrying her husband home. She can have the whole plane, far as I'm concerned. Middle seat's nothing." Faye Duggan looked at him for a second longer than she needed to, the way you look at something you'd stopped expecting to see, and then she said, "Come on then, and thank you. You've got no idea." "I didn't, not yet." The woman in 31E was in her 60s, in a good gray coat, and she had both arms wrapped around a small brass urn like it was the only solid thing in a falling world, and she was, Roy saw at once, terrified. Not the ordinary kind, the deeper kind, the kind where the fear of the flight and the fact of the death have gotten tangled up together and can't be pulled apart. "Ma'am," Roy set his bag down and crouched by the row. "I'm Roy. They tell me you don't love flying, and I've got the middle seat next to you, so we're going to be neighbors. That all right?" She looked at him with wide, wet eyes and didn't quite answer. "I'm going to sit down real slow," he said. Nothing to it. He settled in beside her. The plane pushed back. She flinched at every sound, the thunk of the doors, the whine of the engines spinning up, and her knuckles went white on the urn, and Roy Finnick, who did not know who she was and would not have cared, did the only thing he knew how to do, which was the thing he'd done his whole life. "You hear that whine right there?" he said, conversational like they had all day. "That's the number 2 engine coming up to speed. Good, healthy sound. You want to worry when they're quiet, not when they're loud." "How do you—" Her voice was thin. "How do you know that?" "Because I'm a mechanic, ma'am, 31 years. I fix these airplanes for a living." He almost said fixed. He let it go. "So you happen to be sitting next to about the one person on this whole plane who knows exactly what every noise is. And I'm telling you, none of them are bad noises. This is a good airplane having a completely normal day." The woman looked at him and something in her chest let go just a notch. "You really do this? Fix them?" "Whole life. Matter of fact." Roy leaned and looked past her out the window at the wing as it slid back into the clouds, and he smiled a little, despite everything. "I know this exact airplane. I know her tail number. I've had my hands inside that wing you're looking at. Changed a hydraulic line in it myself, 2 years back. She's a good one. She'll take real good care of you today." And June Corrigan, though Roy did not know her name yet and did not know she owned the airplane he'd just promised her would take care of her, looked out at the wing a stranger had touched with his own hands, and for the first time since her husband died, she felt for one small moment safe. They got to talking, the way you do at 30,000 feet with a stranger you'll never see again when the ordinary walls are down. "You're carrying somebody home," Roy said, gentle, nodding at the urn. He knew the shape of it. He was carrying one too in his own way, 3 states ahead of him in a funeral home. My husband. June's hands moved on the brass. Sam, 4 months ago. And I couldn't. Everyone kept saying, take the private plane, that's what it's for. He had a plane, but I couldn't do it. His plane, without him in it. She shook her head. So I'm flying him home the regular way, coach, to the little town where he grew up. He'd have laughed at me. He always said the coach seats told you more about a company than the boardroom ever did. Smart man, Roy said it and meant it and did not know he was talking about Sam Corrigan. How was? June's eyes filled. I don't even know why I'm telling you this. Because I'm a stranger and I'm never going to see you again, and that's exactly who you can tell. Roy said it plainly, and it was true, and it made her laugh a little through the tears. It's all right. My father, he cleared his throat. That's actually where I'm headed. Same errand as you, more or less. My dad passed last week. I'm flying out to bury him. Oh, June turned to look at him fully. Oh, I'm so sorry, and here I am. No, that's why Faye grabbed me for you, probably. Takes one to know one. Roy looked at the seat back in front of him. 2 people carrying a box across the country. Least we can do is get each other through the flight. June Corrigan looked at the tired, kind man beside her and thought that her husband would have liked him enormously and had no idea how right she was. They flew on. The cabin dimmed to its long cruising hush, that strange suspended country where 140 strangers agree to sit quietly together 6 miles above the earth and trust it. June found to her own surprise that the terror had gone out of her, not because the flight had gotten smoother, but because the man beside her had made the airplane knowable. Every unfamiliar sound now had a name and a father. That hum was the air packs, that thud was the gear folding away, that long soft shudder was only the flaps coming up exactly as they should. He narrated it without being asked, offhand, the way a person tells you the weather, and she understood dimly that this was a gift he'd probably given 100 nervous strangers over the years and never once thought to charge for, because giving it was as natural to him as breathing, and because his whole life had been quietly making sure the thing worked so that people who were afraid of it could stop being afraid. She thought about that, about how many hundreds of flights this one man's hands had touched, invisibly, so that strangers he'd never meet could get home to the people they loved, about how the entire miracle of the thing, a machine that carried the grieving and the joyful and the ordinary through the sky and set them down safe, depended on men like him in hangars at night, whom the passengers never saw and never thought about and certainly never thanked. The whole enterprise ran on invisible care. It always had. And it had never once occurred to June, in 51 years, married to the man who owned an airline, to wonder what it would look like if that invisible care were suddenly, coldly taken away, until she was sitting beside a man to whom exactly that had just been done. She didn't know that yet, she just knew she felt safe, which she hadn't in 4 months, and that the reason was a stranger, and that her Sam would have wanted to shake his hand. Then Roy Fenwick, making conversation, told the grieving widow the story of the worst week of his life, and the floor came out from under both of them, though only one of them knew it yet. So it's been a stretch, Roy said, losing Dad, and I got laid off same week, which is its own thing, but it made it worse. He never knew. I didn't tell him. Let him think I still had the job. You lost your job? June's brow creased. The mechanic job? I thought you said 31 years. 31 years, yeah. Roy huffed a breath, no bitterness in it, just tired. New management came in a few months back and decided they'd rather send the maintenance overseas, cheaper. So they cleaned out the whole hangar, 300 of us, effective Friday. He shrugged, guys who'd been there their whole lives. My dad worked there 41 years before me, and they walked us out with a white envelope apiece and a phone number to call. June Corrigan had gone very still. Which airline? She said quietly. You'd know it. Corrigan. Roy reached up without thinking and touched the little brass wings on his jacket, the way he'd touched them his whole life. See this? The founder, Sam Corrigan. Good man, passed a few months back. God rest him. He gave these out to every mechanic that hit 10 years. Designed them himself. Pinned this exact one on my father in 1985. Made him a promise, too. Said nobody who wore these wings would ever get an envelope. Roy turned the pin in the cabin light. Kept that promise his whole life, old Sam did. Died 4 months ago. Took about 4 months for the new fellas to break it. He tucked the pen back and looked out the window. Anyway, that's my week. Sorry, you didn't need all that. And June Corrigan sat in the middle seat aisle he'd given up, holding the ashes of the man who had made that promise. Looking at a brass pin her husband had designed with his own hand and pinned on this kind man's father 38 years ago. And she understood all at once with a horror that took her breath that the gentle stranger who had given up his seat to comfort her, who had promised her the airplane would take care of her, was one of the 300 human beings that her airline, her company, the thing she owned, had just thrown into the street in her dead husband's name. She did not tell him who she was. She couldn't. She sat there with the ground gone, and she let the man believe he was talking to a stranger, because if she opened her mouth, she was going to come apart, and because there was something she had to do that she could not do from 30,000 feet. She had not known. That was the thing that would haunt her, that she had genuinely not known. Because after Sam died, June Corrigan had folded up like a chair. 51 years of marriage and and then a phone call at 4 in the morning, and then a silence in the house, so total it had a weight, and she had simply stopped. The board had been very kind about it. They'd told her not to worry about the company, to take all the time she needed, that they had it handled. A man named Victor Lund, the COO Sam had reluctantly let the board install the year before to modernize, had been especially reassuring. Leave the running of it to us, Mrs. Corrigan. Grieve. We'll protect what Sam built. And she had believed them, because grief makes you believe whatever lets you stop, and she had signed the things they put in front of her without reading them. Board resolutions and authorizations, because Lund's assistant would come by with a folder and a pen and say Sam would have signed this, and June, who could not bear to think, would sign. Grief is a fog, and men who want things learn to move fast in fog. That was the part that would take June the longest to forgive herself for. Not that she'd been fooled, but that she'd been so absent from her own life that there was nothing to fool. For 4 months she had lived in a robe. She'd let the mail stack up. She'd let the phone go to a machine she never checked. She had spent whole days sitting in Sam's study touching the things on his desk, the pen he'd chewed, the model of the first turboprop he'd flown, unable to imagine that outside that room, the thing those objects stood for was being quietly disassembled by men in better suits than Sam had ever owned. They had counted on her staying in that room. It was, when you got down to it, the whole plan. Keep the widow grieving, get the signatures, close the deal before she came back to herself. She almost hadn't come back at all. That was the truth she'd carry. If a tired mechanic on a crowded flight had not given up his seat and told a frightened stranger that the airplane would take care of her. If he had not, making conversation, mentioned a brass pin and a broken promise, June Corrigan might have stayed in Sam's study in her robe until the whole thing was signed and sold and gone, and never known she'd let it happen. One kindness from one man who had every reason to be bitter and chose not to be. That was the width of the margin. That was how close it came. She now understood, been signing away her husband's life's work, one folder at a time, to men who used his name to gut the thing he loved. Halfway through the flight, when Roy had drifted off, exhausted the way the grieving sleep, Faye Duggan crouched in the aisle beside June with a cup of tea she hadn't ordered. "You knew Sam," June said. It wasn't a guess. She'd seen the flight attendant's face when the man beside her mentioned the name. 30 years I flew for that man, ma'am." Faye kept her voice down. "He came to my wedding, danced with my mother." She glanced at the sleeping mechanic. "You want to know the truth of what's happening to this airline? Sit next to that one for 5 hours. He's the whole story. 300 of them walked out with envelopes, and every one of them the kind of man Sam built the place for." Faye's jaw tightened. "Sam Corrigan would be sick. He'd be physically sick, ma'am, if he saw what they're doing to his people in his name. And there's not a soul left up top with the standing to stop it." June Corrigan looked at the sleeping man and at the urn in her own lap, and she thought, there's one. The contract was going to be signed in 4 days. June found that out the second the plane's wheels touched the ground, and she turned her phone on and it lit up with 4 months of things she should have been reading. The whole deal was there in the emails she'd ignored. Lund and the board had negotiated the sale of the entire maintenance operation to an overseas contractor. The 300 jobs eliminated, the hangar shuttered, the savings booked to prop up the stock ahead of a bigger sale of the airline itself. It was a good deal on paper if you were the kind of person who read the paper and not the people. And it closed Friday. The same Friday the mechanics' jobs ended. In 4 days it would be signed, and signed meant done, and done meant Sam Corrigan's promise wasn't just broken but buried, along with the man who'd made it. June stood in the jet bridge, letting the other passengers stream past her, and she watched Roy Finnick come up the ramp with his garment bag and his father's wings on his way to a funeral. Having given her his seat, and she almost stopped him. Almost said it right there, but she didn't, because a favor to one good man on a jet bridge was not what this was. This was 300 men. This was her husband's whole life. And you don't fix that with a nice word to one of them. You fix it with everything you have, upstream at the source before Friday. She let him walk past. She watched him go. And then June Corrigan, who had not made a decision in 4 months, took out her phone and called the one person she should have called the day her husband died, the family lawyer, Sam's lawyer, the one who'd drawn up the trust. And she said 7 words that were about to ruin Victor Lund's entire year. I'm coming in, don't sign anything, nothing. She walked into the boardroom 2 days later in a black dress, and she had read everything by then. Every folder she'd ever signed, and Victor Lund made the mistake of being reassuring. Mrs. Corrigan, June, you didn't need to come all this way, you should be resting. Sit down, Mr. Lund. She did not sit. All of you stay exactly where you are. I've read the file, every page, including the ones I signed without reading, which is on me, and which I'll be spending a good while making up for. She set a folder of her own on the table. The maintenance sale. The one that closes Friday. It's dead, as of this morning. My lawyer's already filed to unwind it. The table erupted. Lund's voice rose over it. June, Mrs. Corrigan, with respect, that contract is signed on our end. There are penalties. You can't just... I own this airline, Mr. Lund. She said it quietly, and quiet stopped the room. Sam left it to me, not to the board, to me. I let you run it for 4 months because I couldn't get out of bed, and you used that. You used my husband's death and my grief and my signature to do the one thing he spent 50 years promising his people he would never do. Her voice did not shake, which was somehow worse. 300 families, in his name, while the man was barely cold. It's business, Lund said, and there was something almost desperate in it now. Sentiment doesn't survive a balance sheet. Loyalty is a luxury, June. I have watched loyalty put companies in the ground. Where? I beg your pardon? You've watched loyalty put a company in the ground? Where? Whose company? June looked at him, and she saw it, the way you see a crack in a casting. You didn't learn that in a business school, Mr. Lund. You learned it somewhere it hurt. Whose was it? And Victor Lund, 51 years old, master of the balance sheet, did not answer for a moment because June Corrigan had reached, without meaning to, all the way down to the thing. My father's, Lund said finally, and the boardroom had gone silent enough to hear it. He had a machine shop, 40 men, and when the work dried up, he wouldn't lay off a soul. They're my guys. They've got families. Victor, he mortgaged the house to make payroll, lost the house. Then he lost the shop anyway, and all 40 men lost their jobs in the end regardless. Plus, my father lost everything he owned, buying them 6 extra months. Lund's voice was flat and hard. So don't lecture me about loyalty. I watched it take a good man apart, board by board. He straightened his cuffs. I decided a long time ago I'd never make his mistake. You cut fast, you cut clean, and the company survives to employ the ones who are left. That's not cruelty, Mrs. Corrigan. It's the only mercy that actually works. The room was quiet, and June Corrigan, who had spent 4 months as a widow and 51 years as the wife of a man who ran an airline on exactly the thing Lund had sworn off, understood him then and did not hate him and did not let him win. I'm sorry about your father, she said, and meant it. I am. That's a terrible thing to watch, and you were a boy and you learned the lesson too well. She leaned on the table. But you learned the wrong half of it. Your father didn't lose that shop because he was loyal. He lost it because he was alone, because 40 men's loyalty ran one direction, up toward him, and nobody was holding him up. That's not what loyalty is. Loyalty isn't a boss dragging his men down with him. It's everybody holding the same thing up at once so nobody goes down at all. She straightened. My husband had a line. He said it every night on that hangar floor for 50 years. Her voice caught and she let it. Everybody here has their hands on the same airplane. Nobody at the table moved. That's not sentiment, Mr. Lund. That's the whole business model. The reason people flew Corrigan instead of the cheap outfits is they could feel it. The mechanic and the pilot and the woman at the gate all believed they were doing the same job, getting you home. She let that land before she finished him. You want to know what you were really about to sell that contractor for a bump in the stock, not 300 jobs. That. The one thing we had that the cheap guys could never copy. You'd have sold the airplane everybody had their hands on, kept the empty fuselage, and wondered in 5 years why it wouldn't fly. She did not fire him. That surprised everyone, including Lund. I could put you out with an envelope, June said. It'd be fair. It's what you did to 300 better men. She shook her head. But that's your way, not Sam's. So here's Sam's way. The maintenance base stays. The sale's dead. All 300 jobs come back. Every one on the same terms. With back pay for the days they were out. That's not charity. That's what we owe them. And we'll find the money the way Sam always found it, which is by the people at the top taking the cut first. She looked at Lund. And you're going to run the numbers on all of it, she said, because you're good at numbers and I need somebody good at numbers for what comes next. Which is what? Proving to this board that keeping faith with people is the better deal. Over 10 years, not 1 quarter, which it is. Which my husband proved for 50 years without a spreadsheet. She held his eyes. That's your job now if you wanted it. Not cutting the heart out. Showing this board the heart was the asset all along. Lund stared at her. Why, he said, why would you keep me? Because Sam didn't fix broken things by throwing them away, June said. He had a whole hangar full of men who fixed things instead. I married one philosophy and I'm not about to abandon it the first hard week. She almost smiled. Also because a convert's the most useful person in any room. You believe the cold thing all the way. You're going to believe this one all the way too once you see it work. I've got a feeling about you, Mr. Lund. Your father would rather you proved him right the way he'd have wanted than proved him wrong to spite him. And Victor Lund, who had never once in his career been forgiven for anything because he'd never once led anyone close enough to need to, sat down slowly and put his head in his hands for just a moment, and when he lifted it he was, though he'd have died before saying so, a different man than the one who'd set envelopes on a workbench. Roy Fenwick buried his father on a gray Thursday in the small town next to his mother, and he wore his father's wings on his jacket, and he did not know that anything had changed anywhere. He'd gone dark for the funeral. Phone off, world off, the way you do. He said his words. He put his hand on the coffin. He told his father quietly the lie one more time and the last time, that the job was fine, that the promise had held, because it was a graveside and a man is allowed to tell his father a kindness. And then they lowered Ed Fenwick down next to the wife he'd missed for 11 years, 41 years, a Corrigan mechanic, and it was done. It was after, at the little reception in the church basement, that Faye Duggan walked in. Roy blinked at her. You're the flight attendant from the plane. What are you? I flew out for it. Faye had a covered dish in her hands because that is what you bring. Wasn't hard to find. Small town, one funeral. She set the dish down. I came because somebody wanted to come and couldn't get away from a boardroom and asked me to stand in for her. And because I wanted to see the man who gave up his seat one more time now that I know the whole story. She looked at him. You have got no idea what you did on that airplane, Roy Fenwick. None. Turn your phone on. He turned his phone on. It lit up like the whole world had been trying to reach him for 2 days. The message that mattered was not from Corrigan Airlines HR, though that one was there too. The layoff rescinded, the maintenance base restored, all employees to be reinstated with back pay effective immediately, report to your station Monday. The message that mattered was a handwritten note, photographed and texted, on a card that had a small set of brass wings embossed at the top. Sam's design, the company's oldest symbol, the one Victor Lund had almost sold for scrap. Roy read it standing in a church basement in his one good suit. Mr. Fenwick, You gave me your seat when you had every reason to give me a piece of your mind. You told me the airplane would take care of me, and it did, because men like you and your father spent 72 years making sure it would. I didn't tell you who I was on that flight because I was ashamed, and because I had a promise to go put back together. It's back together now, all 300 of them. Your wings mean what they meant in 1985 again. That's not a gift, and it's not charity. It's a debt this company owes you and yours, 40 years overdue, and I intend to spend the rest of my life paying it. Come home Monday. You reminded me at 30,000 feet, without ever knowing my name, of the one thing my husband built this whole airline to be, the thing I had very nearly let them sell for scrap. June Corrigan. And Roy Fenwick sat down on a folding chair in a church basement 3 days after burying the last man alive who'd have understood, and he wept. Not for the job, though the job was there, but because his father had died believing the promise held, and it turned out against everything that the old man had been right. I went back to work Monday. Of course he did. The hangar filled back up. 300 men who'd cleaned out their lockers came and uncleaned them out, and there was a strangeness to it, a resurrection quality, men shaking their heads and not quite believing, telling and retelling the story that had gotten around by then in a dozen garbled versions, the one about the mechanic and the widow in the seat, most of them missing the true shape of it. Roy never corrected them much. He wasn't a man who told his own stories. The back pay came, which mattered more than the boardroom drama, because a boardroom drama does not put groceries in a house. For a lot of those 300, those few weeks between the envelope and the reinstatement had been the worst of their lives. Savings emptied, a wife's face when the health insurance lapsed, a kid's college deposit quietly clawed back, the particular cold sweat of a man in his 50s updating a resume for the first time in 30 years and knowing exactly how the world looks at a 50-something mechanic. All of that had been real, and none of it unhappened just because the jobs came back. That was the cost that didn't show up in June's speech. The weeks of fear you can't refund. She knew it. She made sure the back pay landed the same week in full, and she wrote a letter to every household by hand, 300 letters that said, in part, that the fault was hers for not watching, and that it would not happen again while she drew breath, and that she was sorry. Nobody had ever gotten a handwritten apology from an airline owner before. Most of them kept the letter. And slowly the fear went back out of the building. It takes longer to leave than it does to arrive. Fear always does. But week by week, the men stopped glancing at the door when a suit walked in, stopped keeping one eye on the exits, went back to the old unhurried competence of people who are not afraid, which was, as it happened, exactly the thing that made the work good. You could not have drawn a straight line on a chart from June's decision to a safer airplane, but the line was there, invisible, the way it had always been there under Sam. A company full of people who trust it does better work. It is the oldest and least fashionable idea in business, and it is true, and it had just been proven again the hard way in one hangar in one American town. But June Corrigan came down to the hangar floor that first Monday in flat shoes the way Sam used to, and she walked the line and stopped at every station, and when she got to Roy's, she stood a moment, this small woman in gray, in front of the tall, tired mechanic, and neither of them quite knew how to do it. I never did thank you properly, June said, for the seat. You gave 300 men their jobs back, Mrs. Corrigan. I'd call us square on the seat. It's June, and we're not square. We're not going to be square, you and this family and mine. And I've decided to stop trying, because that's the whole point, isn't it? It's not a ledger. She looked at the wings on his coveralls. My husband pinned those on your father, 1985. Yes, ma'am, June. She reached into her coat and she took out a small box, and inside it was a set of brass wings, new, but struck from Sam's old die, which she'd had dug out of a drawer where Lund's efficiency hadn't quite reached. He'd started these back up before he died, 10-year wings. We stopped when well, we're starting them again, and I wanted the first new pair to go to you. She pressed the box into his hands. Not for the seat, for 31 years. You should have had these back at the 10-year mark, and the paperwork got lost in some efficiency or other. You've earned 4 of these by now. We'll get you the rest. Roy Fenwick looked at the wings in his hand, next to the old worn pair on his chest, and he couldn't say anything for a second. He'd have liked you, Roy finally managed. You're Sam. Guys used to say you could tell the ones who got it and the ones who didn't by whether they knew his line. The one about the airplane. The one about everybody's hands. June's eyes were bright. He said it every night on this floor for 50 years. Yes, ma'am, Roy nodded, slow. That's the one. That's the whole thing, right there. Victor Lund kept his job and did the strangest thing anyone had ever seen a man like him do, which was change his mind in public and stay changed. He ran the numbers June asked him to run, expecting to prove her sentiment couldn't survive a spreadsheet, and instead, because he was honest with numbers even when he wasn't honest with much else, he proved the opposite. Over 10 years, not one quarter, a company people trusted, staffed by people who weren't afraid, that customers chose on purpose, outperformed the cut-to-the-bone version every single time. He built the whole model out. He presented it to the board with the fervor of a man who had found religion late and was making up for lost time. And he never once mentioned that the model was really just a spreadsheet of the thing Sam Corrigan had known in his bones for 50 years without ever writing down. What nobody ever knew, what Lund himself only half admitted, and only to June, and only once, was that the numbers were not really what changed him. The numbers were the excuse. What changed him was standing in that boardroom and hearing a widow describe his own father back to him more truthfully than he had let himself remember the man in 30 years. He had spent 3 decades believing his father was a cautionary tale, a good soft man destroyed by loyalty, a mistake to be corrected. And June Corrigan, in about 4 sentences, had handed him a different father, not a fool who loved his men too much, but a man who had simply been alone, holding 40 people up with nobody holding him. Lund had built an entire career, an entire self on the first version. It is a terrible thing to be handed a truer picture of your own dead father at 51 in a room full of strangers by the person you have most wronged. It is also, if you are honest enough to look at it, the beginning of becoming a person worth being. Victor Lund looked at it. That was the whole of his redemption, and it was enough because he never looked away again. He visited his father's grave that year for the first time in a long time. He didn't tell anyone, but June noticed he stopped talking about efficiency like it was a religion, and started talking about it like it was a tool. Useful, limited, in service of something it could never itself supply. And she knew where a man learns a distinction like that. He learns it standing over a grave, finally forgiving the person in it, which is the same as finally forgiving himself. He came to the hangar once, a few weeks in, found Roy under a wing. Fenwick. Roy slid out on the creeper, wiped his hands, looked at the suit. Didn't say anything. I set your badge on the workbench, Lund said. It cost him visibly. And I told you it was arithmetic. I want to say I did the arithmetic wrong. I left something out of the equation and it turned out to be the biggest number in it. Your father's promise. It had a value. I couldn't see it, so I set it to 0. That was bad math. He held out his hand. I'm sorry, Mr. Fenwick. Roy Fenwick looked at the hand a long moment. Then he shook it, because his father had taught him that a man who fixes things doesn't throw away the ones that break, he mends them. You keep proving that math, Roy said. That's how you say sorry to 300 guys, not a handshake. The math. Every quarter, you get up in that boardroom and you prove keeping faith was the smart play, so they never get the itch again. He nodded once. Do that and we're square, Mr. Lund, envelopes and all. Years later, when Roy Fenwick finally retired, 40-plus years in that hangar like his father, like the 72, now grown past 90 between the two of them, the airline had a little ceremony on the hangar floor, which was not a thing they used to do, and had started doing again. June Corrigan was old by then, and she didn't come to many things, but she came to that, and she stood up, this ancient small woman who'd once been a terrified widow in a middle seat, and she told the whole hangar the true version of the story, the one Roy had never told right, about the worst week of a mechanic's life and the seat he gave up to a stranger carrying her husband home, and the brass wings that reminded her at 30,000 feet what her Sam had built and what she'd almost let be sold for parts. Everybody here has their hands on the same airplane, she said at the end, and her voice was thin now, but the whole hangar said it back to her, 300 and more voices, because it had become the thing they said, the way you say a prayer you mean. My husband believed that. This man's father believed it. This man believed it so hard he gave his seat to the one person on earth who most needed to be reminded of it and never knew he was reminding her. That's what we are when we're right. That's the whole airline. Don't ever let anybody sell it for parts again. And they didn't. Not for the rest of any of their lives. The airline stayed small and stayed slow to grow and stayed the kind of place a man would walk through a wall for, which turned out over the long haul that Victor Lund's spreadsheets finally learned to measure to be the most valuable thing an airline could possibly be. Roy Fenwick pinned his father's old worn wings, 1985 Sam Corrigan's own two hands, onto the coveralls of a 25-year-old kid hitting her 10-year mark the same day he retired, and he told her the thing you tell them, the promise. The one that got broken once and put back together at 30,000 feet by two people carrying two boxes home. Long as this airline's in the air, Roy told her, nobody who wears these ever gets handed an envelope and walked to the door. That's not how it's done here. That's a promise. It got tested once, hard. It held. It held.